The purpose of these ranking videos is to help direct people into picking the best weapon for their playstyle. It is not necessarily highlighting the best options, but more so the most useful ones. So when I'm talking about weapons that have a like for like, but they're just not as good, I'm going to be more critical of it and tell you guys that if you like the playstyle of this weapon, you might find more success with the other one instead. Now, I'm not going to tell you which weapon is more fun because that's subjective, and my job is not to entertain, but to educate. Like, people think I just complain for the sake of complaining, or as if I only like the most broken weapons. Like, my personal favorite things do not correspond with any of these ranking videos at all. Anyway, rant over. It had to be said to a very small minority of people, but for today we are going to rank all 54 unique DLC skills from worst to best based on how useful they are in PvE. Now, not to get confused with the regular Ashes of War, those things are different. These are going to be the unique skills of the special weapons or the somber weapons that cannot be infused. If you did want to see the regular Ashes of War, I already made a video on that one. And also, I just want to give a quick little shout out to my guy Steven, the test dummy. He's been with me for over 2 years, and he's been working very hard for me this entire DLC experience, so give some love to my guy Steven in the comment section. Starting off at the bottom, Dragonform Flame of the Forked Tongue Hatchet. This skill does a fire-breathing AoE attack that is very reminiscent of Fire Breather of the Steel Wire Torch. In fact, it's literally identical in every single way. The only differences being is that Fire Breather is literally cheaper and does more damage. Like, yeah, the Torch literally does more damage than the Forked Tongue Hatchet skill, and I don't know why. They went ahead and gave this thing like a really cool name, but then made it work exactly the same way as Fire Breather and then think we wouldn't notice or something? Like, why? Number 53, Blindfold of Happiness of the Lamenting Visage. Now, this skill is just going to be a stealth-based skill. It just makes you partially invisible for 15 seconds, and you can just walk through areas without being noticed. Now, the effect is quite literally the exact same as Assassin's Gambit Ash of War, but that one is just going to be better because it lasts twice as long, and it's a faster animation and can be put on many different types of weapons. The only downside is that it does take away a little bit of your health when you cast it, but it's like only 35 HP. Like, I'd still just use Assassin's Gambit every time if you did want to have stealth, which is still going to be a niche use. Number 52, Moore's Charge of the Verdigris Great Shield. It actually does do a charging shield attack that is basically the exact same thing as Shield Crash. Same animation, same length and everything, even very similar stamina cost. They can also both send enemies flying and knock them down. Now, Moore's Charge does have a little bit of like an AoE effect at the end of it, so it does have more of a chance to hit multiple enemies and send them flying. But it doesn't do any damage at all. Like, Shield Crash at least does do some amount of damage. Can work with the multi-hit talismans. You could put it with a bleed infusion, and you could proc bleed nicely too. It is also going to be cheaper. Now, it does do less stance damage, but it's not by much. Shield Crash does 26 stance damage, and Moore's Charge does 30 stance damage. So there might be certain circumstances to where it actually is useful, but I would just rather have Shield Crash on this weapon instead. Number 51, Feebled Lord's Frenzied Flame of the Nanaya's Torch. Now, this skill is going to be something more for PvP due to its madness properties, because yeah, in PvE, it's not going to be good. The damage is terrible. You can hold onto the button and actually will just constantly cast it over and over again for 3 FP per tick, and it could potentially help clean up kills, but the damage is very poor and I wouldn't really bother using it. If madness could actually be very useful in PvE, it'd be nice to just do a little bit of madness bit up pretty quickly. But there are just other spells in this game that could just work way better than this. Number 50, Bloodfiends Bloodboon from the Bloodfiends Sacred Spear. Obviously very comparable to Bloodboon Ritual from the Mogwin Sacred Spear. Same animation, same FP cost. The differences being is that this one does have a much smaller AoE, but you can like shoot it out like a projectile, so it can go a lot further. But unfortunately, it sucks. Like, there's no reason to use it over the Mogwin Sacred Spear. The damage is terrible. The blood loss build-up is just way worse as well. And you might as well just take a few steps more forward and just use the Mogwin Sacred Spear because it does it in like a very wide AoE. Much better chance of hitting multiple enemies. The projectile comes out a lot faster. You actually do get hyper armor, unlike the Bloodfiend Sacred Spear. And being in closer proximity to these enemies means that you can help proc things like the Lord of Blood Exaltation and the White Mask. And after using the skill, the weapon actually does get buffed, unlike the Bloodfiend Sacred Spear. So yeah, that's not really like any purpose of this skill existing. Number 49, Roaring Bash of the Golden Lion Shield. This skill is identical to Shield Bash in every way, in like it's a quick little just shield attack that you can get, but it does do like very similar damage, the exact same stance damage. The only difference is that this one is a little bit more expensive and does a little AoE effect. So if you are surrounded by multiple enemies, it can just hit both of them, where Shield Bash is probably only going to hit one at a time. So it is just going to be extremely niche. I probably still wouldn't really use it over like a brass shield with shield bash, because that one is just going to be a better shield alongside a very similar skill. And if you did want to attack with a shield, there is like a whole dedicated weapon class now that can just do this for you. Number 48, Lightspeed Slash, which is from the light version of the Greatsword of Radahn. Now the skill does perform as a jumping attack, doesn't really do that much damage, do get a little bit of hyper armor, does about 20 stance damage. Now you can fully charge it to do respectable damage, does actually do 32 stance damage in total as well, and you do get a lot more hyper armor in this state. Now for me personally, it is just not worth the 32 FP at all. There are a lot of other skills in this game that consume just as much FP as this, have just as long as an animation, but just can melt way more. And also, you can just use the Lord version of the Greatsword of Radahn, because that weapon is identical in every way as it pertains to like the damage, scalings, requirements, but it just gets a higher damaging skill, so you're just better off using that one instead. Number 47, Repeating Fire of the Repeating Crossbow. Now this skill does shoot out 12 different bolts in quick succession for 26 FP, which is way too high in my opinion, because the damage is just not that good. Maybe if it worked with things like the Shard of Alexander or the Rolana's cameo, it might be a bit better, because yeah, it doesn't actually work with either of those talismans. You might think it procs status effects quickly, but it doesn't really do that either. Like every single bolt is like a much worse version than like one regular bolt. And it literally took like over 30 to 40 bleed bolts just to proc bleed on the most basic of enemies. Like it is just not efficient at all. And probably worst of all yet, it consumes so much stamina, like your entire stamina bar is gone after every single use. And you might think it does some decent amounts of stance damage, but no, doesn't do good stance damage either. It's only 1 stance per bullet. So you can hit for a total of 12 stance damage if every single bolt hits, but that's pretty rare to happen as well, especially if you're fighting those smaller enemies that can dodge around a whole bunch. So yeah, this thing is in need of a buff. Number 46, Rancor Slash of the Spirit Sword. Now there are two different versions of Rancor Slash, one for the Curved Sword, one for the Halberd. We're going to talk about the Curved Sword variant, and this thing is identical to Sword Dance. It's just a reskinned version, which Sword Dance is a decent skill, can do some nice damage, can stun lock enemies pretty good. Now Rancor Slash does actually buff the weapon with like some Ghost Flame throughout the animation to help proc Frost. It's not going to do it that quickly. You're probably going to have to use it a few times just to proc the Frost. And it also does shoot out these little like Ghost Flame skulls that don't really have like the greatest tracking and don't do much damage. There's just like no reason to use this over regular Sword Dance. You could put Sword Dance on like any other curved sword, like a Bandit's Curved Sword with a Frost infusion, and it's going to proc Frost faster, it's going to do more damage, have more range, costs half the amount of FP, and it's just going to do just as much stance damage, unless you're hitting with like those little skulls that Rancor Slash does have, of which is going to do like 2 more stance damage. And those things like don't even do much damage anyway. Like yeah, there's not really much of a point. Number 45, Sleep Evermore of the Tolier's Hidden Needle. I don't know how to say the name, but this skill is like a reskinned version of Impaling Thrust. Impaling Thrust is a very good skill, very nice lunge, pretty quick, decent stance damage, and also pretty risk-free too. Now, putting Impaling Thrust on a very short-range weapon might not be the best thing. You might come into some issues just coming up short, but it still is a decent skill. Now, this weapon actually does get passive Eternal Sleep build-up, and for every single time you hit with a skill, it will proc with about roughly 130 sleep, which isn't anything too crazy, because enemies are very sleep resist in this game, especially like the bosses. They could be upwards of like 600-700 sleep resist. Now, it does also have the unique effect of just doing more damage to enemies that are put to Eternal Sleep, which there's like not that many enemies that can be outright slept. Most of them just get staggered, and of which if they're staggered, you're not going to get that bonus damage. And enemies that are put to Eternal Sleep don't wake up anyway, so you're just doing bonus damage to enemies that don't even wake up when you hit them. So I'm not really sure what the exact use is there. Now obviously Eternal Sleep doesn't work against the bosses, so like the Godskin duo, you're only going to have like 5 seconds of Eternal Sleep, of which you could just use the skill over and over and like melt them quickly while they are put in this state. But like there are so many things nowadays that can just melt the Godskin duo that you don't really need something like this. I don't know, sleep should just be way better than what it is right now. We might as well just continue talking about sleep and just put on the Mists of Eternal Sleep here as well, which is off the new Saint Trina sword. This skill is identical to the sword of Saint Trina. It just procs Eternal Sleep instead of regular sleep. If you don't know what Eternal Sleep is, like all enemies that normally can be put to sleep completely, it also does the exact same thing, but it lets it be so where you actually hit them, they don't actually wake up. Now, unfortunately, this doesn't work against bosses, so against the Godskin duo, the Eternal Sleep effect only lasts to about like 5 to 10 seconds. So you kind of get about like 5 to 10 seconds worth of this damage, and you will notice that the effect wears off because like Eternal Sleep is like a deep purple and regular sleep is like more of a lighter purple. But the skill of these sleep-based weapons should just be like actual damaging-based stuff, but they just get sleep too. It should just be like a card hitting, very unique type of attack, does some good stance damage too, but like on top of that, it just can get sleep. And also, while we're at it, the way sleep should work is that against enemies that just get staggered while they're slept, they should be vulnerable to a critical attack. Like every time they get staggered, just walk up to them and just do a riposte. Now it shouldn't work that way against NPCs, otherwise it'd be broken in PvP. But like just being able to stagger an enemy slightly, like once or twice per fight because enemies are very sleep resist, it's not that useful. It really isn't. And none of these weapons get arcane skillings, so you can't really go spec into more arcane to get faster sleep buildup. So it still takes a while. It's not like these things have 100 sleep buildup. You can probably do it quickly if you have 2 Saint Trina Sword power stands and both buffed, and you might be able to do it a little bit quicker. I don't know, sleep is such a missed opportunity in this game. Could have had way more unique skills and sleep-based spells, and it could have been fleshed out a lot more, but instead we just have this. Number 43, Romina's Purification of the Pole Blade of the Bud. Now this skill just lets you become airborne, have you fly around a whole bunch, hit some enemies, and do some Scarlet Rot build up with these like butterfly attacks. The damage itself is just not good at all. The whole purpose is to proc Scarlet Rot, which obviously is a good status effect. Now, unfortunately, you only get like 200 Rot buildup if like all those butterflies hit an enemy, which is like not that much at all. There are other like spells and weapons that can proc Rot so much faster, way more consistently, and a lot safer too. Because this thing has you like just flying all over the place in a long animation, and you get like no hyper armor. You get hit one time and collapse straight to the ground. You can like swing and fly around pretty fast, so it can be pretty decent to like go in and out of cover, but it's still like so niche. It needs to get buffed to where it just does like more damage, better rot build up, because the way that it is right now, it's still very mediocre. Number 42, Rancor Slash of the Spirit Glaive. Already talked about Rancor Slash on the Spirit Sword, and I'm just going to like this one better because it just goes a lot further and actually does respectable damage. Now, still going to be the same thing as it is like a reskinned version of the Sword Dance Ash of War. Does consume like twice as much FP, still does a little bit of frost build up with the Ghost Flame animation. One thing that I did wish is that it actually buffed the weapon with the Ghost Flame, because the weapon actually doesn't get passive frost buildup at all. You only get frost with the skill. So if it is buffed up and with more Ghost Flame after using the skill, that would have been pretty interesting. But as it stands right now, I wouldn't really use it over regular Sword Dance with like a halberd. Like if you have a Guardian Sword Spear with a cold infused Sword Dance, it's just going to do more damage and proc frost faster for like half the FP cost. But Rancor Slash on the halberd does do 30 stance damage, whereas Sword Dance on a halberd only does 20. So there is going to be a use there as well. Number 41, Deadly Poison Spray off the Deadly Poison Perfume Bottle. This shoots out a big poison cloud surrounding the player character, and as any enemy standing inside of it is going to get procced with poison very quickly, and this does include the player as well. Now this is going to do Deadly Poison, which is just a better version of a regular poison. It ticks like twice as fast, but it does only last 30 seconds, so it might have some better synergy with things like the Kindred or Exaltation Talisman. Now, there are going to be other types of deadly poison sources that could just proc it more consistently without having you get poisoned as well. But the benefit of you getting poisoned is that you can go ahead and proc things like the Mushroom Crown and Kindred or Rot Talisman if you proc poison on yourself. So if you find an enemy that's immune to poison, you can still benefit off these buffs. I probably just recommend carrying a bolus alongside with you to like heal the poison effect. And if you're going through like a Scarlet Rot area or fighting a Scarlet Rot boss, you can actually throw on the Ailment Talisman and then proc poison on yourself, and then you just get twice as much resist to both poison and rot for the next minute. But best of all yet about this skill, you don't even need the requirements at all. You can just go in with like any random build and just proc poison on the enemy or yourself depending on what type of use that you really need it for, and you could benefit that way. Number 40, Revenge of the Night of the Shield of the Night. Now this skill does shoot out a little like magic projectile attack that does scale off the dexterity stat. Doesn't do that much damage at all, but it could be a good way to clean up kills for only 5 FP. But to actually make it do respectable damage is using it as a guard counter. After you do a block and then click the weapon skill button, it actually shoots out like a much more powerful version of that projectile skill. Does like roughly 4 times as much damage, and it does do 10 stance damage. Now this skill is still not going to be like the highest damaging thing. It's not going to be like the most amazing option in terms of like a projectile. And also it doesn't work with things like the Curve Sword Talisman or the Deflect tier. I don't know why. It would be so much nicer if it could work with those things. But unfortunately, it only works with stuff like Shard of Alexander. And being that you only really benefit of using it when getting a guard counter, and most enemies are just going to be like hitting you with melee attacks, you're going to be at closer range, of which you'd rather just like guard counter with your weapon, because that's going to be doing more damage and much more stance damage. But this thing actually does do it as a very nice and quick projectile attack that is very hard to dodge. So the only benefit is just guard countering projectile attacks. Number 39, Painful Strike of the Tooth Whip. Now this skill for 16 FP does a whole flurrying whip attack which is very reminiscent of like the Dark Souls 3 variant. I don't know why this thing wasn't like a passive or like default Ash of War for all the whips. That would have been really cool because it is a nice stun locking attack that can do some okay amounts of damage. It does do 14 stance damage. And with the Tooth Whip in particular, it does proc Deadly Poison, so you can proc that quickly, and it actually does decrease stamina recovery speed against enemies, which in PvE is just going to be useless. Now the major downside to this whip is that you have to be close to benefit off the entire combo. Like I mean like directly next to the enemy, because it does not have that good a range. The last swing does get really good range, but it's not going to be doing that good of damage, and for 16 FP, just hitting once is not worth it. So you're going to have to be standing right next to an enemy just to benefit off the entire combo, and it can stun lock smaller enemies, but it's nothing too amazing. Number 38, Devonia's Vortex off the Devonia's Hammer. Now for only 16 FP, you do this like short range AoE attack that does a nice amount of damage and a very high stance damage. You have the option to either use it uncharged or fully charged, and both can actually be very decent. Now this is obviously very comparable to the Ordovis's Greatsword and the Ordovis's Vortex skill, and that one is just going to be better in almost every instance. It consumes less FP, has a much faster animation, and quite literally does more stance damage. Like when this thing is fully charged, Ordovis's Greatsword does 66 stance damage, whereas this one does 52, which 52 is still a lot of stance, but you could just do way more in less time. Now, yes, Devonia's is going to do more damage, but it's not even that big of a difference. They all get like similar scalings, and it's like a 15 to 20% damage difference. And this thing is like a colossal weapon, and the other one's a greatsword. Now, it actually is going to do more stance damage uncharged. Actually does do roughly 35 stance damage uncharged, whereas the Ordovis's Greatsword only does 20 uncharged, so it could have like better uses there. But like a fully charged version of Ordovis's Vortex is like almost just as fast as like an uncharged version of Devonia's Vortex. It would have been nicer if this thing had like a different type of skill, because trying to beat out something like Ordovis's Vortex is going to be hard to do. Like this is like an S tier weapon, like one of the best in the game. So it's hard to compare. Like if the Ordovis's Greatsword didn't exist, this thing could potentially be like top 10, but it does exist. Number 37, the Madding Spear Hand Strike of the Madding Hand. Now this is just going to be like a punching attack that doesn't do much damage, but it does a bunch of madness build up, which yes, in a PvE list, why is this going to be higher? And that's because this thing just straight up just trivializes all NPC encounters throughout the entire game, and there's a lot of NPC encounters in the DLC. You can just throw this weapon on every single time and just start punching things, and it's going to instantly proc madness. Then you just like switch back to your main weapons and just clean them up that way. It can be extremely powerful. It does require a little bit of faith, so if you don't have a faith build, you could just throw on something like the faith tier and just destroy every single NPC. Number 36, the Shadow Sunflower Headbutt of the Shadow Sunflower Blossom. Now this skill just like slams the sunflower into the ground like a decent holy based AoE attack. The skill does scale off AR. It is only 16 FP, and the skill can actually do 20 stance damage. There are follow-up inputs for an additional 8 FP that actually can hit an additional like 3 more times, and the entire combo can do 65 stance damage and actually stun lock nicely. You get very good amounts of hyper armor. Now the problem is with the skill is that it's just outclassed by the charged heavy attack. Like the charged heavy attack can just do more damage and actually just do more stance damage faster. So if you're just constantly spamming this attack, it's just going to be a better version of the skill. Now the skill can actually stun lock a bit better with those like follow-up attacks that it does get. And it does get more hyper armor. So in instances of which you're fighting like faster enemies that are constantly staggering you, you could just use this skill and it can be a nice stun lock. But there aren't going to be too many more situations where I'd use this skill over the heavy attack. Number 35, Euporia Vortex of the Euporia. Now I did make a whole dedicated video to this one weapon and talking about how the whole skill works and how good it actually is or how bad it actually does perform sometimes. Because yeah, this thing is a very complicated weapon and I'm not going to get into too much detail now. So if you wanted to know more about how it works, go check that video out. But basically for 28 FP, you do like this spinning weapon type of attack. But the whole purpose of the skill is that when you actually damage enemies, it like charges up the weapon. And when the weapon is charged, it turns it into a projectile. Now the projectile isn't going to do that much more damage than like the base skill, but you can charge it up a second time, of which the projectile is going to do a lot more damage, can actually do 80 stance damage. You can actually like free aim it and track around with it as well. Now the problem is that it takes a long time to get to this second charge because like it decays and there's like a timer, and it doesn't really happen as often as you'd like. And the skill itself is still going to be a longer animation, of which you get no hyper armor in. I think the biggest use of the skill in its current state is that the first charge is somewhat easier to get to, and you can just keep spamming like the first charge of the projectile version, which isn't going to be doing that much damage, but it is still going to be a decent projectile. Number 34, Solitary Moon Slash of the Greatsword of Solitude. Now I know this is a very popular weapon, a lot of people like it, and if you have found a great success with this weapon, I recommend just continuing to use it. But for me personally, I don't really like it that much. Now for 12 FP, it does shoot out like a wind-based projectile attack. Now no, this does not work with the Enraged Divine Beast Talisman. It is going to work somewhat similar to Vacuum Slice weapon skill, but Vacuum Slice is just better because it goes further, same speeds, does more damage, and does like twice as much stance damage. Vacuum Slice doing 20, this one doing only 11. But it does get the option of a follow-up input for only an additional 10 FP that lunges towards the enemy in a nice like horizontal swipe that does do an additional 28 stance damage. So the entire combo can do roughly about 40 stance damage, but like so can 2 vacuum slices, and you can be sitting at a safer distance because yeah, this thing involves having to like lunge towards the enemy, which is potentially going to be very risky. And like the most annoying thing about this, it consumes a lot of stamina. Like the stamina cost is really high. Now I think like the best part about the whole skill itself is like due to its variety. Like you get a mix up of like a nice lunging attack and having a projectile that can do some nice stance damage, and it's not that expensive either. But like if you did want a skill that can like lunge forward and do some nice damage in a strength-based build, the Meteoric or Greatsword just kind of just works better. But as I mentioned, this one is going to be more versatile with like a projectile attack mix-up too. So it does like everything somewhat decently, but it doesn't really do anything the best. Number 33, Dynastic Sickleplay of the Obsidian Lamina. Now this skill is actually very good for 7 FP. You do this iframing dodge, which is iframe dodge is actually going to be a lot better than like a regular dodge roll in terms of how many frames that it has. It's not going to be as like spammable as like a regular dodge roll, but it's still nice. And for an additional 9 FP, you can do like a follow-up attack that can do some nice damage, and you can click it again to just do a couple more swipes and do this like cool retreating animation. So yes, this thing is very similar to Dynast's Finesse of the Bloody Hellas, and unfortunately, it is just worse than the Bloody Hellas in like every single way. The Bloody Hellas is cheaper, it does more damage, it lunges further, it does piercing damage, it's quicker animations, does more stance damage, it can be redirected, you can like track in every single direction, can't really do that with the Obsidian Lamina. It gets better bleed, scaling, blood loss build up, like everything that it has is just better. Like the only positive thing that I can say about Dynastic Sickleplay is that you can dodge in like any direction when locked on. With Bloody Hellas, you can only dodge backwards, whereas Dynastic Sickleplay, you can dodge side to side, but you can just turn on manual tracking or like just lock off and just dodge side to side with the Bloody Hellas too. So it's like a small little thing that this one does do better, but yeah, across the board, there is like almost no reason to use this one over the Bloody Hellas. Number 32, Kowtower's Resentment of the Gazing Finger. Now this skill for 31 FP does like a holy based AoE attack in front of the player. It doesn't really go that far, but when you have it fully charged, it does go like a lot further and does do a bit more damage. Now the entire stance damage is not going to be that high. It is 22 stance, whether it's uncharged or fully charged. And being that it is doing holy damage, it is going to scale off the faith stat, and it's only getting an E scaling in faith, so your total overall damage is not going to be that high. I wish it got like a much better faith scaling. It would have been cooler, because like for 31 FP, it doesn't really feel like it's worth it. But the fact that it can go pretty far when fully charged is going to be the best part about it. Number 31, the Spinning Guillotine of the Putrescence Cleaver. Now this skill for 12 FP does like jump up in the air and slam to the ground, does some okay damage, does do 20 stance damage. You can hold onto the button to continuously spin over and over again for an additional 7 stance damage per hit and 7 FP. It can help proc things like the multi-hit talismans. The weapon does get passive frost build-up, so it can proc frost too. You actually can click the heavy attack input that does like another additional spinning attack, and this can actually hit pretty hard and do 30 stance damage too. It can actually do a lot of damage to certain types of enemies, and it can stun lock them pretty nicely. These animations can be a bit on the longer side, and you can't really cancel them that quickly either. So you might notice that you're trading out a whole bunch. But the main reason I don't really value it that much is because the Wild Strikes Ash of War just kind of works better. You can just put it on like another Great Axe with like a frost-based infusion, and it's going to do more damage for cheaper, much more consistent, less risky because you can like roll out at every single swing, and it's going to proc frost faster too. It would have been cool if this thing had like some AoE ghost flaming attacks as well to help separate it from Wild Strikes, but unfortunately it doesn't really get any of those. Number 30, Darkness of the Sword of Darkness. Now this skill for 30 FP does like a holy based AoE attack. It is a very long animation. The damage can be okay, but for 30 FP and how long that it takes to cast and how little hyper armor that you get as well, it's not going to be useful as a damaging option. However, this thing does debuff enemies to make them take 20% more holy damage for 60 seconds, which is very good. This just makes holy based builds even more viable now. Now the fact that it is like a long animation means that you're probably going to get hit every single time that you use it. So if you did want to start off the fight with like a holy debuff, it's probably going to result in you getting punished. So do keep that in mind. But this just is going to result in 20% more damage to your holy sources, and it's a debuff, so it's going to stack with all the other buffs that you have too. Number 29, Moon and Fire stance of the Rolana's Twin Blades. This skill goes into a stance of which, with a light attack input, it does a bunch of magic projectiles. It's going to be a 3-part combo, so it can consume 30 FP. Every single projectile does only do 3 stance damage. It's not going to be like the highest damaging thing, but it can stagger those smaller types of enemies. And as for the heavy attack, it is going to summon this like fire tornado that can stun lock those smaller enemies too. Do it in like a wide AoE, shoot out a bunch of these pillars. The total overall damage can be nice, but you don't get any hype armor and you can get staggered out of it. And being that you have to be close range to use it, it's very likely that it would happen. But the main reason why I don't really value this skill as much is because the Sword of Night and Flame skill just works way better. Both the magic and the fire-based versions are just a lot more consistent, do more damage, can do more stance damage, and potentially be cheaper too. Like the magic-based version of Sword of Night and Flame is only 26 FP, and this attack can do way more damage than the entire magic combo that the Rolana's Twin Blades gets. And obviously that entire combo is going to be like a longer animation too. And in terms of the fire-based attack, it's very similar damage, very similar stance damage and FP cost, but the Sword of Night and Flame can just throw it out as a projectile and do it in a nice horizontal spread in just like one hit. So you have to worry about like a longer animation or having to get staggered out of it and like just miss out on so much more damage. Now the tornado does do it in like a 360-degree radius. So if there are enemies like to the left and right of you, it is going to be more consistent to try and hit them with this. So there are more uses there. And obviously it is more fun, but yeah, this one is just objectively better. Number 28, Horn Calling of the Horned Warrior's Sword. Now this skill is going to shoot out a big holy AoE attack that actually does go pretty far for only 17 FP. The animation is like very reminiscent of Gravitas, but actually do get some hype armor, which is very interesting for like a ranged based AoE attack. It is going to do pure holy damage and it does scale off the Faith stat, which unfortunately this weapon only gets a descaling in Faith, so it's not going to be that high of damage. But it can do 15 stance damage, and it is a quick skill that's very hard to dodge. So you can just keep using it over and over again. Unfortunately, it just consumes a lot of stamina. Like almost your entire stamina bar is gone when using it. So you can only realistically use it like one time every like few seconds. Otherwise, you're just going to get punished super hard. But with how easy it is to actually connect with this skill, you can just keep running backwards in a boss fight and just keep spamming the skill over and over again. And you might find a lot of success that way. Number 27, Jori's Inquisition of the Barbed Staff Spear. Now this skill for 6 FP shoots out a volley of these like golden arcs. Now you can hold on to the button to make it last even longer, and it can consume a decent amount of FP very quickly, and the damage output might not be as good, especially against those skinnier enemies, because all the projectiles go in way different directions, and a lot of them can just miss sometimes. But against those larger targets, it can do very nicely. And also, the projectiles can do blood loss build-up, because like the weapon itself does do bleed, and it might just be a bug, but these golden arcs can actually proc bleed. It'll take a while to do it, but you could definitely proc bleed at least once or twice in a fight. Like, it's not going to be doing amazing damage, and you do have to stay still while you are using the skill as well, but it can perform pretty well. Number 26, Tremendous Phalanx of the Moon Irithal's Night Sword. Now this skill is going to be like Great Blade Phalanx, but just for a weapon skill instead. And all 3 projectiles can do a decent amount of damage. It's not going to be doing like that much because the skill scales off intelligence, and this thing only gets a descaling in intelligence, so the damage could actually be a lot higher. But unfortunately, it gets stuck with this descaling. Now you do get the option of a follow-up input for only 6 FP that does lunge towards an enemy. And you are going to be lunging with like a colossal sword, so it is going to be doing some decent amounts of damage, and it definitely is worth the 6 FP. Now the entire stance damage of this combo is going to be doing 39, which also is very decent. It's 24 for the projectiles if all 3 of them hit, and 15 for the follow-up input. So no, it's not going to do anywhere near the amounts of stance damage as a Glintblade Phalanx once did, so it's not going to really be a replacement for that, but it still can do some nice stance damage. Number 25, Golden Crux of the Greatsword of Damnation. Now this skill is going to be predominantly for PvP due to the skill working like a grab attack. For 21 FP, you jump up in the air and slam to the ground. The damage itself isn't going to be that good, but as I mentioned, against NPCs or other players, it does perform as a grab attack, of which the follow-up is going to be guaranteed, because a follow-up input can do some high amounts of damage. But in PvE, you have to click the button again for an additional 10 FP, which isn't too bad, and then it can perform nicely. It does do a total of 33 stance damage too. And this AoE does scale off AR, so you don't necessarily have to go into Faith to use it. Now my problems with this skill is that it is too expensive, 31 FP for the entire combo, especially the first part, because that first part the hitboxes aren't going to be that crazy to try and hit something, and there is a good chance that you miss. And in that instance, you just wasted 21 FP, and a decent chunk of the damage actually comes out of this part, and of which you're probably just missing out on half the damage if you do miss. And when you do land on the ground, you don't really get any hyper armor, so you can get staggered out of it too. So it is going to be more of a risky skill to use, but if you do land the entire combo, and if you do fight a lot of NPCs, which there are a lot in this DLC as I mentioned before, it could definitely be very good. Number 24, the Onze's Line of Stars of the Star-Lined Katana. Now, this skill does a cool flurry of like these magic-based attacks that does like extend the weapon's range and hit with these like very quick attacks that can stun lock pretty nicely. It's kind of like a magic-based version of the Rivers of Blood because it's just going to be a bunch of like these double swiping attacks. And with continuous inputs, you can just keep hitting more times. And the last attack can do this like insane front flipping attack that does decent amounts of damage. Now, this entire combo can stun lock. The fact that it does extend the range and can stun lock at these further distances is obviously going to be a positive. And the entire combo can do some really large amounts of damage. It does also do 30 stance damage with this combo too. Now, the obvious problem is that it's a longer animation of which you get no hyper armor. So against a lot of different bosses, they're not going to give you that opening and they're probably going to punish you. And also, this is an intelligence and dexterity based katana, of which it has to compete with the Moonveil, and that one is just going to be way better. You literally do just as much stance damage in one Moonveil attack than you do with the entire combo of the Starline Sword. And if you just use the Moonveil attack twice, it's going to be doing more damage too. Now, this one doesn't really require as much intelligence and it is going to scale better off dexterity. So you're just going all into a dexterity build. It could be nice there. But if you wanted a pure dexterity type of katana, the Sword of Night is just going to be better too because that one can just do more blood loss build up and do more damage quicker too with a lot less risk. So although it does have its uses, most of them are just going to be outclassed by something else. Number 23, Horn Calling Storm of the Horned Warrior's Greatsword. Now this skill for 22 FP spins around in a circle and does this crazy ass storm attack that can stun lock these smaller enemies, and for an additional 10 FP you can just keep spinning around over and over. So it is very reminiscent of the Stormcaller Ash of War, but just spins a little bit slower, which can be a lot worse because that means you're not going to be able to stun lock those enemies for as long. They're going to be like dodging it in between attacks, which is not good to have. And against those larger enemies that cannot get staggered, that just means a longer animation of which you're just probably going to get punished more so than you would have with Stormcaller. Now the entire combo can do 40 stance damage, which is very similar to Stormcaller, but you could put Stormcaller on like a Great Stars and you could stun lock better, you could do bleed, give yourself some health regen, and not consume as much FP either. But the major benefit of Horn Calling Storm is going to be its range. This thing goes like 3 times as far as a regular Stormcaller, and if you're surrounded by a bunch of enemies that can get staggered, it's basically just a GG. Like this thing can just clear out an entire room of people. But if you're doing like a 1v1 boss fight, I'd rather just like take a few steps more forward and just use Stormcaller instead. But it's not like it's going to be a bad skill at all. 22, Promised Consort of the Lord version from the Greatsword of Radahn. This skill just does a bunch of these like cool ass combo attacks that can get some nice hyper armor, can stun lock enemies, does periodically shoot out a bunch of these like holy based pillars that can do some more damage on top of it. The entire combo can actually melt pretty hard and actually does a total of 52 stance damage. Now it does consume a total of 40 FP, which is going to be on the higher end. And unfortunately, these holy based projectile attacks are going to be scaling like off the intelligence, but they don't really scale that well. And obviously they're doing holy damage, which paired alongside a weapon that does magic damage and physical damage, you're going to have to try and spec into one or the other to try and maximize that damage, which is like really annoying. Because if you spec into things like holy damaging buffs, you can actually output a decent amount, but that means you're going to be sacrificing regular weapon damage. But you can just use this skill as your main primary option, and it's paired alongside things that could help like FP regeneration or FP cost too, and you could probably make a very good build. Number 21, Rancor Shot of the Bone Bow. Yeah, bows have just gotten like a lot better in this DLC. There's some like really solid options and some good talismans to make them do some very respectable amounts of damage. But yeah, this skill is basically like the Barrage skill, but it just does more damage than Barrage, and it actually has like the most insane tracking too. Like this thing can like curve around and do like a full like 90-degree turn and hit certain types of enemies that are just moving really quickly. And you can just continuously spam it for only 3 FP. And also just do good damage, especially paired alongside all the new talismans that you get. Doesn't really matter what you're spamming, whether it be like regular arrows or status effect arrows, they can still be very nice. Now, I probably don't really like it as much as the Ansbach's longbow, because that one can just do better total overall damage, but this one is going to be a lot easier to use. Number 20, Smithing Art Spears of the Anvil Hammer. this skill does actually do this cool short range AoE attack, can do some nice amounts of damage, actually does do a total of 45 stance damage too, which is like just as much as a charged heavy attack, which is amazing because you get a lot of hyper armor throughout this animation and potentially actually hit multiple enemies at once. Now this skill is obviously comparable to the eruption skill, and this eruption Ashura, you can put it onto many other different types of weapons like other colossal weapons, and it can just do more damage than smithing art spears, especially if you pair it alongside the talisman of the dread, and it could just do way more damage and also just consume less FP. But the benefit of the Anvil Hammer and the Smithing Art Spears skill is going to be that it does do more stance damage. Like it does like 20 more stance damage than Eruption. So if you wanted a skill like this, you're kind of picking and choosing to whether you want to actually like really good damage or really good stance damage. And both are going to be fine options and you can't really go wrong either way. 19, Poison Spear Hand Strike off the Poisoned Hand. This skill just procs poison so incredibly quickly, and it's going to be deadly poison, which ticks like twice as fast as regular poison, but only lasts 30 seconds, which actually can be a good thing, because that means you can keep the uptime for buffs such as the Kindred of Rot Exaltation and the Mushroom Crown, and also this weapon just works the same way too. You just get more damage every single time that you proc poison on yourself or a nearby enemy. But I can just recommend using this with like any single arcane build. You can just go into the fight, proc poison straight away with this thing because it does like upwards of like 300 poison buildup, even like at lower amounts of arcane. And all it takes is like a punch or two to proc poison, and then you can just switch back to your main weapons. And then you just be doing poison and actually just get bonus damage as well. So yeah, I think this thing is very useful. Number 18, Deadly Dance of the Cursed Blades Cirque. Now this skill actually does a whole big ass flurrying attack that can jump in the air and just stun lock enemies really quickly, do some high amounts of bleed build up because the weapon does get some passive bleed, does do 16 stance damage, and you can get a follow-up input that can kick enemies that can also do very high amounts of damage and 15 more stance damage. So the entire combo can do over 30 stance. And yes, this thing is going to pair very nicely with the multi-hit talismans, and you can just keep the buff of these things active at all times. Now the starting up animation might be a bit long, but it actually does like lunge pretty far, so you can use it at a safer distance and then go into the enemy. Now unfortunately, as for the follow-up kick, it doesn't lunge very far at all, so there are going to be plenty of instances of what you just miss. And the stamina cost of the entire combo can be pretty high as well, but this thing can just do amazing damage, and you can pair it alongside the Dancer set to just further enhance the damage. And as a whole, the weapon can perform very nicely. Number 17, Flare O Serpent of the Serpent Flail. Now this skill is honestly incredible. For 8 FP, you buff your weapon with plus 90 fire damage, and it's like an instant buff as well. It lasts 30 seconds. And if you just use like a regular heavy attack, a jumping heavy, or a running heavy attack, it actually does do an explosion AoE that does remove the buff, but the damage is like really good. It like doubles the damage, it like can send smaller enemies flying, and actually does like an additional 12 stance damage too. So if you're doing a charged heavy attack with this thing, you could do upwards of 50 stance damage. Now the unfortunate part is that it's a flail. Flails have a terrible moveset. The charged heavy attacks are so unbelievably long. Like if this skill was on a hammer instead, it would be like one of the best weapons in the entire game. It would be incredible. But unfortunately, we get stuck with a flail and those heavies are just so slow. Like it can be very viable. It makes them a lot better, because you are doing over 50 stance damage and really high amounts of damage in general. But it's to the point where like a charged heavy attack build is just not going to be the optimal way to build around it. Probably going like with a jumping attack build would just be better, especially if you have a second one, which yes is going to require New Game Plus. But power stancing Serpent Flails with the buffs active and spamming the jumping attacks can make for a very deadly build. It is going to have you constantly keep buffing the weapon. But as you can see, the results are just like amazing. They just do like monstrous amounts of damage and really high stance damage. Number 16, Weed Cutter of the Rakshasa Great Katana. Now this skill is just going to be a bunch of horizontal swipes. They swing very wide and far, of which you can hit multiple enemies very quickly. The swing itself is actually pretty fast for a Great Katana as well, so it can result in decent amounts of DPS and some nice blood loss build up. It's not going to be like the most groundbreaking thing. It's only going to be 11 stance damage. It's not going to be like the highest amount of DPS. You're not going to get that much hyper armor either. But it just does add really good moveset variety to the weapon itself because the heavy attacks are going to be a nice poke, so it complements nicely. So yeah, the whole skill is just very cheap, efficient, and versatile. 15, Fan Shot of the Ansbach's Longbow. Now this skill for 12 FP just shoots out 8 arrows at once in a nice horizontal spread, and these things can do amazing damage, especially if you pair them alongside some of the new talismans, specifically the Precision Talisman. This one actually does allow you to get 12% more damage when free aiming and not actually locking on, and being that it's actually very easy to aim with this thing because it's shooting out in a horizontal spread, you can just get a lot more damage this way, and you're shooting 8 arrows at once. So therefore, the status effect build-up is also going to be very good, but you don't even need status effect arrows because the damage is still perfectly fine without them, but you just have that as an option too. And for only 12 FP and how quick that you actually can spam it over and over, it's going to be an amazing skill. The only downside is that it will just melt through your ammo supply, so you have to buy a bunch more arrows. Number 14, Light of the Sword of Light. Now, very similar to the Sword of Darkness, this skill is just not going to be good as a damaging option. In fact, it's actually even worse. Like, the skill is like super long animation and just does like horrendous damage, no stance damage. I wouldn't use it to damage things, but the benefit is going to be the fact that it is a buff. It is a body buff that gives you 20% more holy damage for 60 seconds, which is incredible. And the fact that it's a body buff means that it can stack with Golden Vow. So any single type of holy build that you have, you're just going to benefit off using this. And yes, this actually will stack with the Sword of Darkness too. I'm going to value this one a bit more though, if you were to pick and choose between one or the other, because with a debuff, you have to like individually apply it to every single enemy. Whereas if you have a buff, you can just get more damage to everybody. And you don't have to worry about hitting the actual enemy with the skill too. You can actually use this skill in a safe spot and then go ahead and engage with an enemy. So yeah, if you're running a holy based build, this is basically a must have. Number 13, Discus Hurl of the Smith Script Shield. For only 3 FP, it just like throws out the shield Captain America style, has a little bit of a delayed effect, so enemies that like to dodge and move around, it's not going to be that easy to dodge. They're probably going to get hit more times than not. And it just like zooms straight to the enemy really quickly and does some decent amounts of damage for only 3 FP as well, and very low stamina cost. Like, this thing is very spam friendly. You can just keep clicking it over and over again. It's not going to do like the most amazing amounts of DPS, but it's a very solid projectile that can clean up enemies very quickly. And if you're lacking a ranged option, this one is just going to be chip damage at a distance too. Number 12, Mesmer's Assault of the Spear of the Impaler. Now, this thing is just very high damaging. You do a whole bunch of these like attacks while airborne. You get an okay amount of hyper armor, although you can get staggered out of it in some instances. But this thing can hit so many times, of which can proc the multi-hit talismans very nicely. And the entire combo can just decimate all types of enemies in this game if it is able to get landed. Because yeah, that's going to be the biggest downside. It is very long and you can get interrupted out of it. So certain bosses are just not going to let you get it off. But being that you are like frantically moving all over the place, you might be a harder target to try and hit. And against skinnier enemies that can get stun locked, it's just going to be doing a bunch of damage. And actually can get like an AoE finishing attack too. So if you are surrounded by a bunch of enemies, this is also just going to work. The skill can be somewhat harder to aim too, and you might just like miss a whole bunch of attacks. So yeah, when it doesn't work, it is noticeably bad, but when it does work, it's amazing. Number 11, Blinkbolt Twin Axe of the Death Knight's Twin Axes. This skill combines the Blinkbolt Ash of War with like a follow-up like spinning attack that can do some nice amounts of damage. But yeah, Blinkbolt is amazing because it is going to be an iframe dodge. So it literally allows you to close the distance very safely. And with the follow-up inputs, you can just do the attack straight away, even before the animation actually finishes. And this attack itself can also lunge very far. If you do it at point blank range, you're potentially going to like overshoot your enemy and just straight up miss. But if you like blink bolt in a direction that's at a safer distance, and then you can go ahead and use the follow-up skill, and that can lunge towards the enemy, actually does work a lot more consistently that way. And this attack can actually proc the multi-hit talismans, do some high amounts of damage, does do 30 stance damage too. So this attack can require somewhat of a higher skill level, but it is going to be a very rewarding skill to use as well. Number 10, Honeblade of the Bonnie Butchering Knife. Yeah, this thing actually surprised me how good it actually was. Now, the weapon itself does give you some passive health regen per hit. Every single hit is 1% more health back. And with the skill, it actually does buff the weapon for 30 seconds, gives you plus 35 more physical damage, and it actually does double the healing effect. So every single hit is going to result 2% more damage. Now, the best part about the skill is potentially bugged because it doesn't really say it on the description itself. But when you hit with the weapon when it's uncharged, it actually does queue up all of the health that you would have gained if you had it buffed. And then when you use the buff, it just gives you that health back. So meaning if you hit with the weapon like 50 times when it's not buffed, and then you use the skill, it's going to give you 50% health back and then buff the weapon. Like, that might potentially be a bug, but you can just use this skill as a way to just have like an extra heal on hand. Just go through an entire legacy dungeon, just hit a bunch of enemies, go to the boss, and then when you're like getting weak, you can just use the skill and it can heal you back up again. And the funny thing is, you actually can like unequip it and like re-equip it again later on and then use the skill, and it works that way too. Now, I think this weapon does shine best when you have them power stance. If you manage to get a second one and buff both at the same time, it's going to be 4% more damage per hit. And the Great Axe moveset is actually pretty quick, so you're getting a lot of health regen in that meantime. And if you're hitting with the weapons uncharged, Soon as you get an opening again to rebuff, you can just use the buffs and that can heal you too. Now it's not going to be like anything groundbreaking like the Blasphemous Blade in terms of health regen, but it can get pretty close. Number 9, Needle Piercer of the Letter's Sword. Now this skill does shoot out a pretty decent holy projectile attack. The skill actually kind of just goes straight towards the enemy and just shoots all around them. So it's going to make it to where it's very hard for an enemy to dodge it, and it is going to serve as some nice amount of damage. I kind of wish the damage was a bit better. If the weapon had like a B scaling in Faith more so than a D scaling, that probably would have done it. Now the skill actually does scale off AR. You don't necessarily have to go into Faith. You can just go level up Dexterity and it will benefit. And it is a quick animation. The whole projectile does do 10 stance damage. At point blank, when you hit with the weapon, it is going to do 20 stance damage. But you can just use it as like a quick projectile attack when enemies just get away from you. Just do some nice chip damage at a distance, have them come back in, and then you could just use the weapon. Now the skill also does have the transitive properties of the Law of Regression spell, so it can actually dispel all types of buffs when you do hit an enemy with it, which in PvE is not going to be like the most useful thing. But one thing you do have to watch out for is that it can dispel status effects. So if you do have a status effect like Frost or Poison inflicted onto an enemy, using this skill is going to remove that effect, which is unfortunate because you do want to have these effects active. But for the most part, this skill is very good. Number 8, Flower Dragonbolt of the Flower Stone Gavel. This skill shoots out a very decent lightning projectile attack that just goes straight towards the enemy. Does it in like a nice AoE, so even if enemies try to dodge it, they're probably still going to get hit. The skill is going to scale off Arcane, so going into a lot of Arcane is going to further enhance the damage. I kind of wish it was Faith instead, because if you go actually hit with this skill, it does debuff enemies to make them take more lightning damage. Whether it's charged or uncharged will be dependent in if they actually take 12 or 15% more lightning damage. So that means you can just like spam the skill over and over again to just constantly benefit off just more damage. And the skill can hit pretty hard for only 18 FP, which is very good. But yeah, if this thing just had a Faith scaling, it'd be so much more useful and have much better synergy with other types of builds. But in that instance, you could just use the Florisax Spirit Ashes because they actually wield this weapon and they can debuff the enemies for you. That could be an alternative. But yeah, the skill itself is still very easy to use, goes pretty far, and just does really good damage. Number 7, Witching Hour Slash of the Sword of Night. Now this skill for 21 FP does a 3 swiping combo attack that can do upwards of 130 bleed build up, does do 14 stance damage. You can actually fully charge it to make it do even more damage and do roughly twice as much stance damage at 27, which is very decent. Now, unfortunately, whether it's fully charged or not, it's still going to do the same 130 bleed buildup. I kind of wish it was a bit more when fully charged, but the skill is still going to be very good. It's going to do a decent amount of damage. It's going to work with the multi-hit talismans. Having it fully charged is going to make it lunge very far. Obviously, it's going to be a bit longer to charge it up, and you're not going to get hype armor, so you can get staggered. But if you find your correct openings and have your positioning correct, you can like lunge into the enemy and hit with the whole 3-hit combo, and it can do a lot of damage. Number 6, Unending Dance of the Dancing Blade of Rana. If you have an opening longer than a couple of seconds, this is like one of the best skills to use in the entire game. This just utterly decimates enemies' health bars so quickly. For only 2 FP per attack, you do this whole like flurry of attacks over and over again, and every single one of these can just do really good damage and really good sustained DPS, especially if you have the multi-hit talismans, Shard of Alexander, and potentially even wearing the Dancer set. All these things can boost the damage to such crazy high amounts to where the result can be what you see on screen right now, just huge amounts of damage. Now the obvious downside is that when you go up against an enemy that doesn't give you an opening for that long, it's not going to be that viable, of which you can just use like the light attack combos, they're going to serve perfectly fine. It's also not going to do that good a stagger damage, so going up against those smaller enemies, it's probably not going to stun lock as well. But the skill is not going to be that risky to use either way, because you can just like roll out of it after every single swing. So it's not like you really get punished for trying to do the skill, it's just probably not going to be doing as much damage with those smaller openings. Number 5, the Dragonwound Slash skill of the Dragon Hunter's Great Katana. Now this skill does actually do a little jumping attack, doesn't really do that much damage, doesn't do that much stance damage either, but you do get some very nice amounts of hyper armor, and you can have this skill fully charged to turn it into a projectile attack, which can hit pretty hard, can actually do 17 stance damage, and at point blank range, when you hit with the weapon as well as the projectile attack, it's going to be doing 33 stance, which is also very decent. The skill is just going to get boosted by AR, and it does just do pure physical damage. So there are lots of different things that you can use to boost the damage of this skill to make it be very viable. Also can do bonus damage against dragons, so it can just mess them up very quickly too. I think like the only major downside of this skill is that it's not going to be as high as damaging as some other things in this game. There are some other skills that can be like just as long as an animation, but can just melt a lot quicker. But like the major selling point of this skill is going to be its ease of use. It gets like lots of hyper armor and it's a very quick projectile. Number 4, Red Bear Hunt of the Red Bear's Claw. This skill does a bunch of these sideward swipes, can do a 3-hit combo, in total can consume 24 FP and do 33 stance damage for the entire thing, 11 stance damage per swing. And the damage can be very good and it can stun lock those smaller enemies very easily. Like it's basically a guaranteed 3-hit combo. Like that's how well it can stun lock. It has this like after wind effect when swinging, and this effect can like stun lock and just do really good damage and like hit multiple times. Now this skill does not get much hyper armor and it does consume a lot of stamina, so you're not going to be able to really spam the skill as much as you would like, but this is just going to be like the best way to go about using like the claw weapons. Like this just does so much damage, really good blood loss build up, and amazing stun lock potential. Number 3, White Light Charge of the Ancient Meteoric Ore Greatsword. This bad boy just like lunges super far for only 10 FP. The damage of the lunge is not going to be anything amazing, but the whole purpose is to get from A to B as fast as you possibly can for the follow-up attack that does monstrous amount of damage in this crazy-ass AoE attack that is actually going to scale off your AR. And being that this weapon does get really good strength scaling, you can just go like all into strength and also get a decent amount of stance damage as well. The entire combo can do upwards of 24 stance damage, which is definitely not too bad for how quick that actually can be used. There are so many instances to which you can like create an opening with a weapon like this, more so than with a regular weapon because you can close a distance so fast. Now I think like the downsides of this weapon is that it can consume a lot of FP, like 35 FP for the whole combo. And it does feel like that sometimes the AoE explosion doesn't really go that far, so you can miss a whole bunch, and it might be a bit harder to aim, but the overall power of this skill is just undeniable. Number 2, Blinkbolt Long-hafted Axe of the Death Knight's Long-hafted Axe. This skill basically combines Blinkbolt into some big-ass slamming attack on the follow-up input. But yeah, as I mentioned before, Blinkbolt is going to be an amazing way to get from A to B without much risk because it is going to be an iframe dodge in the meantime. And then before you even finish like the Blinkbolt animation, you actually can do like the follow-up jumping attack. And this jumping attack, it does get some nice amounts of hyper armor, and you slam to the ground in a decent AoE that can do really high amounts of damage and do upwards of 33 stance damage. And this whole combo is only consuming 21 FP. And on top of all this, it's just a fun skill to use. You can just like teleport through attacks and just quickly punish openings with like high damaging attacks with like no startup frames. And the recovery frames are also very quick. You can like roll out of this basically instantly. It's such a high damaging skill with such little risk involved and such little cost. There's like virtually no downsides. At number 1, Revenge's Blade of the Falx. Now, this weapon could have easily been interchanged with like any other type of weapon in the top 10 because they're all pretty close. There was like nothing like that was definitively the best weapon in the game, at least out of all like the unique skills. So you can switch this one out with like anything else in like the top 5 and I wouldn't even be too mad. But the reason why I went with the Revenge's Blade is because it just does so much damage, works well in creating openings, and just procs bleed so incredibly fast too. Because yeah, the first initial attack is going to be like a quick lunge that you can fully charge and just run really fast and get to an enemy quicker to actually get your whole combos out if you did see an opening. And the initial like swiping attack can do some high amounts of damage, and you can do a follow-up input for 10 FP that just swings the weapon from side to side like a crazy maniac. And it does such large amounts of blood loss build up and just amazing damage. And there's so many different types of talismans that can help boost the damage of this thing. And it can just melt almost every single enemy that can get bled out in this game. Even if they can't get bled out, it's still going to be a very solid option. And I think best of all yet, this thing can just stun lock all these smaller enemies and can do upwards of 35 stance damage. Like this is a curve sword doing this much, and it could do it that quick while having that cool charging attack that can help close the distance. Like if you have good positioning and good spacing and your timing is also very correct, this thing can be one of the most deadly weapons in the entire game. And I consider it to be the best unique skill in the entire DLC too. Anyway, that is now done and completed. Knowing my luck, there's going to be like an update tomorrow that like buffs 1,000 things and nerfs 1,000 more. If there is, I wouldn't complain. That just means we can just make more content. That's great. So please do like and subscribe for when that happens. And also just let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. If you have your own interesting findings, we can just discuss them there. And also do follow me on Twitch because I will be starting to do some challenge runs pretty soon as well that are going to be involving the DLC. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.